Hey everybody, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and we are here today to compare Christopher Moltisanti and Tony Soprano's relationship with Jesse Pinkman and Walter White's. Now, this is the second episode in a two-episode series, but don't worry if you haven't seen the first one yet. They are both designed to stand on their own, with the first comparing the two of them directly. In this episode, we will compare Chris and Tony's relationship with Jesse and Walt's by first taking a second to look at the nature and origins of those relationships and how that influenced the dynamics that were present, before moving on to the different aspects of those dynamics, such as manipulation, loyalty, etc., and then end by shifting our focus to the mentors, where many of these aspects come together when you compare their respective goals. Now, before digging into that, we should take a second to look at Jesse and Chris's actual families, since they would be a significant nurture part of the nature versus nurture equation, and in this regard, Jesse was dealt a much better hand. Sure, there were clearly tensions between Jesse and his parents, and considering all that happened, that's certainly understandable, but the important thing is that there was no malice. They tried their best, and Jesse knew it.
Well, you did your best.
And whatever happened with me, it's on me.
Of course, we don't really get to see Jesse's youth, but we have no reason to believe that his home life in any way pushed him towards a life of crime. Christopher, on the other hand, is a different story. His father was killed when he was a kid, and from what little we see of his mother after he's grown, she seems pretty ineffectual. This left Tony as Chris's primary role model his entire life, which makes him much more of an all-around mentor to Chris, as opposed to Walt, who, on multiple levels, is pretty much just a science teacher. He met Jesse as a science teacher. That's how he remained through most of their relationship, and Jesse still called him Mr. White throughout the series. Walt was a teacher at heart. He seemed to genuinely enjoy it when we get to see him do it.
Carmen is carbon.
And he was good at it. After less than a year under Walt, Jesse goes down to Mexico and cooks a batch that's a little over 96% pure, which
I can guarantee you purity of 96%. I'm proud of that figure. It's a hard-earned figure.
was as good as Gale with years of schooling. Now, obviously, Jesse didn't learn chemistry, just how to cook, so in that regard, Walt was like a trade school with no business classes. You see, unfortunately for Walt, he didn't know the meth business, he just knew how to cook it. And that's why he recruited, or rather blackmailed Jesse into joining him, because he needed Jesse in order to get into the game. Tony, on the other hand, didn't really need Christopher for anything. Their relationship wasn't initially rooted in some sense of being criminally mutually beneficial. It was more genuine than that, and we often see Tony giving Chris life advice.
I don't know if I'm ready. Don't overthink it. Either jump in with both feet or don't.
Now, we don't get to see Chris's childhood either, so we don't really know how much Tony did or did not encourage him to enter the criminal world. Tony may have tried to keep him out, like with Jackie Jr., but realized it wasn't going to happen, so he took him under his wing. Or Tony may have been like Richie with Jackie Jr. and been actively facilitating his entry into the mob life since day one. But either way, by the time the series starts, Christopher himself clearly wants to be in, and this is why much less manipulation is needed to keep Chris in line. Now, that's not to say that there was no manipulation involved. There certainly was, with the most notable example being the killing of Detective Haydu. In this instance, even after Haydu points out that Chris might be being manipulated,
You're being set up. He's lying to you, whoever he is.
Wouldn't make any difference.
Chris really doesn't care. This is in stark contrast to Jesse, who is constantly being manipulated, with the most notable example being the poisoning of Brock. Now, to be fair, I don't think Tony was capable of the level of scheming that Walt demonstrated there. That being said, he didn't need to. He gave Chris the chance to leave, and Chris stayed. Chris really didn't need much to keep him in. Jesse, on the other hand, didn't really want the partnership with Walt to begin with, and was dissatisfied with it as often, if not more than he was satisfied, so much more was needed to keep him involved. It's here that I must take a second to address a huge difference in the dynamic of these two relationships. Jesse also had to bring Walt back into the game at one point, which is something that Chris never had to do with Tony. I bring this up to emphasize that Jesse and Walt's relationship really was a partnership through most of it, as opposed to Tony, who was all in from the pilot episode, and this difference would be pivotal in defining what Tony and Walt wanted. Tony wanted an eventual right-hand man and possible successor, while Walt did not. Walt was dying and had no real interest in setting up any organization that would survive past his own death. Tony, on the other hand, was part of a very old organization, so long-range planning was a much bigger part of his thought process. Now, it's important to note that both Tony and Walt did care for Chris and Jesse, although I think Tony's was a bit more genuine, which is weird since Tony killed Chris while Walt saved Jesse. That being said, Walt did put out a hit on Jesse, it just wasn't carried out, and he arguably only saved Jesse at the end because he knew he was going to die anyway. If the situation was similar in The Sopranos, and Tony was going to die anyway and had the opportunity to save Chris, I don't doubt that he would have. When comparing their effectiveness as mentors, it's important to note the difference between being a good mentor and being a successful one, even though the two can be closely related. Both of them were good mentors in the sense that they looked out for Chris and Jesse and taught them things that would help them excel in their field, but neither of them were successful. In the case of Tony and Chris, it was a failure both ways. Tony failed to groom Chris as a number two, Chris failed to live up to expectations and ended up being killed, but in this case, I think the failure is more on Chris. Tony gave him every opportunity and advantage you could hope for, yet Chris remained ungrateful and threw it all away. In the case of Walt and Jesse, Walt clearly failed in his goal, as evidenced by the fact that Jesse teamed up with Hank and ended up costing him 6 barrels full of money. Now, it could be argued that Walt was a successful mentor even though he didn't really want to be one, since by the end, Jesse was a very good cook, he managed to survive, and could have started back up again, but of course he didn't want to. When circling back around to nature versus nurture in regards to Chris and Jesse, it's fair to say that Chris had both, while Jesse arguably had neither. Both were willing to screw people over for money, however, Christopher was very violent and naturally fearless, while Jesse was not a violent person even when tweaking, which pretty much means that Jesse was not cut out for a life of crime at a higher level. Christopher was also brought up to be in that life with a mentor that really was trying to help him, if you could get past the whole thing with Adriana.
Whatever happened there? All right then.
While Jesse was not. Now granted, Walt did teach Jesse how to cook well, but Walt also made Jesse so infamous and his style of cooking so unique that it would have been impossible for him to start back up again without immediately drawing heat had he so desired to do so. Well, thanks for watching another episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next score.